My husband died on a Monday morning. I know the exact time, 7:14 a.m., because I was holding his hand when the monitor went flat, and I stared at that number on the clock above his bed the way you stare at something you can never unsee. By Friday of that same week, my house was no longer mine. Not because of the bank. Not because of taxes. Not because of any mistake I made. Because my son had been preparing for that moment for 2 years. And I, a woman who spent 30 years of her life notarizing legal documents, who could spot a forged signature from across a room, who taught evening classes on estate law at the community center, I had signed every single paper myself. With my own hand. Without reading a word. My name is Margaret Caldwell. I am 71 years old, and I live in Atlanta, Georgia. For 3 decades, I worked as a licensed notary and legal document specialist. I raised 2 children. I built a life with a man I loved for 44 years. And then, in the worst week of my life, my eldest son dismantled everything we had built, quietly, legally, and with my full signature on every page. If you are new here, please subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you are watching from. You would be surprised how many people have written to me saying some version of this story happened in their own family. Maybe it happened in yours. Now let me tell you how this started. Gerald and I met in the summer of 1979 at a church picnic in Decatur. He was 28 years old, recently returned from 2 years working on an oil pipeline in Louisiana, with calloused hands and a laugh that made everyone in the room turn their heads. I was 26, working as a receptionist at a law firm downtown, already studying for my notary certification because I wanted more than answering phones. We were married 11 months later. Our life was not glamorous. Gerald worked in commercial HVAC, installation, maintenance, repair. He was the kind of man who left the house at 6 in the morning and came home smelling of metal and sweat, ate dinner without complaint, and was asleep by 9. He never asked for much. He never spent beyond our means. And over 44 years, that discipline built something real. We paid off our house in 2003. A 4-bedroom colonial on Briarcliff Road, with a magnolia tree in the front yard that Gerald planted the year our daughter was born. We had a modest investment account, nothing dramatic, roughly $280,000 built up over decades of small contributions and careful decisions. We had 2 vehicles, both paid off. We had no debt. We had 2 children. Diane, our daughter, lives in Charlotte with her husband and 3 grandchildren I adore. She calls every Sunday without fail. And then there was Daniel. Daniel was our firstborn. He came into the world difficult and never entirely stopped being that way. As a child, he was brilliant, genuinely, remarkably intelligent, but he wore that intelligence like a weapon. He argued with teachers. He manipulated other children. He could talk his way into and out of anything, and from the time he was very young, he seemed to understand instinctively that information was power and that the best way to get what he wanted was to make sure other people didn't have all the facts. Gerald and I told ourselves it was a phase. It wasn't a phase. Daniel went to Georgia State, studied business, graduated near the top of his class. He had a string of jobs that always began with promise and ended with tension, a conflict with a supervisor, a dispute over credit for someone else's work, a sudden departure that he explained vaguely as a philosophical difference. By his late 30s, he had started his own small consulting firm, which gave him the freedom to operate without anyone looking over his shoulder. He was charming when he wanted to be. At family dinners, he was funny, attentive, full of questions about what Gerald and I needed, whether the roof was holding up, whether we'd had the furnace serviced. He called his father every week. He sent flowers on my birthday. We believed in him the way parents believe, selectively, hopefully, against the evidence. Gerald was diagnosed with congestive heart failure in January of 2021. He was 69 years old. The doctors were honest with us. This was manageable, but it was not curable. His heart was operating at roughly 35% capacity. He would need medication, monitoring, and eventually more intensive intervention. We had perhaps 2 to 5 years, depending on how his body responded to treatment. We told both children at the same time, over a Sunday dinner at our house. Diane cried. She held her father's hand across the table and asked what she could do. Daniel asked about the will. Gerald and I exchanged a look. Daniel noticed and immediately softened it, said he only wanted to make sure everything was in order, that he wanted to help us get our paperwork organized so we wouldn't have to worry. He said it with such genuine-sounding concern that I almost convinced myself I had imagined the first question. I did not imagine it. That dinner, I understand now, was the night Daniel started planning. The first thing Daniel did was offer to help. That sounds harmless. That is exactly how it is supposed to sound. In the spring of 2021, about 2 months after Gerald's diagnosis, Daniel began coming around more regularly. Once a week, sometimes twice. He would bring groceries, sit with his father, watch baseball games on the television. He would ask me if I needed anything handled, calls to the insurance company, appointments to be scheduled, forms to be filled out. I was grateful. I was also exhausted. Managing Gerald's medical care while continuing to take on occasional notary work and keeping the house running was more than I had expected it to be. When Daniel offered to take things off my plate, I let him. The first document I remember signing was what he described as a healthcare proxy update. He said our existing documents were outdated, the forms had changed since we'd last filed them, and the hospital had sent a notice requesting updated paperwork. He brought a folder, opened it to the signature page, pointed to the line. I remember looking at the header of the page. It did look like a standard form. I remember thinking I should read the full document before signing, 30 years of professional habit telling me to slow down, and I remember Daniel saying, quietly, that the notary at his firm had already reviewed everything and it was routine. I signed. I am a notary. I signed a document without reading it because my son told me it was routine. I have spent a long time sitting with that fact. Over the following months, Daniel periodically brought papers. A form related to Gerald's supplemental insurance. An updated beneficiary designation for a small life insurance policy. A letter from the Homeowners Association that required a signature acknowledging receipt. Each time, the folder was already open. Each time, he pointed to the line. Each time, there was a quiet, reasonable explanation. I signed all of them. What I did not know, what I would not know for nearly 2 more years, was that mixed into those folders, carefully positioned between legitimate documents, were papers of an entirely different nature. A power of attorney that gave Daniel full legal authority over our financial affairs. A deed transferring ownership of our home from Gerald and me into a family trust. And the trust documents themselves, which named Daniel as sole trustee with unilateral authority to manage, sell, or transfer any assets held within it. All signed. All notarized by a notary at Daniel's firm who I had never met and who, I would later learn, was a former employee who owed Daniel a professional favor. All completely legal. The second warning sign came in the fall of 2021, and I ignored it for reasons that still embarrass me. Diane called me on a Thursday evening, upset. She had spoken to Daniel about coming to Atlanta for Thanksgiving, and he had told her, not asked, that the holiday would be at our house, that he was handling the arrangements, and that she should simply plan to arrive and he would take care of everything else. She found the conversation strange. Daniel had always been difficult with her, competitive in ways that made no sense between siblings, but this felt different. More proprietary. As if he were managing the household rather than visiting it. I told her she was reading too much into it. I told her Daniel was under stress with work and that he was channeling his anxiety about his father's health into logistics and planning, which was his way of feeling useful. Diane went quiet for a moment and then said, "Mom, I hope you're right." I was not right. That Thanksgiving, Daniel spent the entire visit in quiet conversation with Gerald in the study. Twice I walked past the door and saw maps spread on the desk, property surveys, I thought, though I didn't stop to look more carefully. When I asked Gerald about it later, he said Daniel had been explaining the trust structure, that it all sounded sensible, that Daniel was just making sure everything was organized. Gerald trusted his son. So did I. Or rather, we trusted who we needed him to be. The third warning sign was a phone call I received in March of 2022. A woman named Loretta, who worked at our bank branch on Peachtree, called to ask if I had authorized a change to the signatory permissions on our joint savings account. She said that a power of attorney document had been presented at a different branch and that our account had been updated to include a third authorized signer. I told her I had not done this. She put me on hold for 4 minutes. When she came back, she said she was sorry, that there appeared to have been a miscommunication, and that she would flag the account for review. She gave me a case number. I called Daniel that evening. He was calm. He said he had added himself as a signer at my request. Didn't I remember? We had discussed it at Thanksgiving, he said, and I had agreed it made sense given his father's condition, so that he could handle banking if there was ever an emergency. He was so specific about the details of the conversation I began to doubt my own memory. He sounded slightly hurt that I was questioning him. I did not follow up with the bank. I did not ask for documentation. I did not pull out the case number and pursue it. I told myself that if I couldn't remember agreeing to something, the problem was my memory and not my son's honesty. I had just turned 70. It is easy when you are 70 and tired and watching your husband diminish to decide that your confusion is the problem. That is exactly what Daniel was counting on. The fourth warning sign was something Gerald said to me in October of 2022, about 4 months before he died. We were sitting on the back porch in the early evening, the way we did most nights that fall. Gerald was thinner by then, moving slowly, but on good days his mind was entirely clear and he was still the same man, still the same laugh, still the same steadiness that I had built my life around. He said, out of nowhere, "Maggie, if anything doesn't feel right after I'm gone, you call Harold first." Harold Simmons was our longtime attorney. We had used him for our wills, our original estate planning, various property matters over the years. He was in his late 60s, semi-retired, but still practicing. I asked Gerald what he meant by "doesn't feel right." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I think I may have signed some things I didn't fully understand." Daniel explained them, and it all sounded fine, and I trusted him. But I've been thinking about it, and I'm not sure I asked enough questions. I asked him what things. He said he couldn't remember exactly. Said his memory wasn't what it was. Said maybe it was nothing. I said, "Gerald, if you're worried, we should call Harold now. Tonight." He said he didn't want to cause trouble. He said Daniel was his son, and he didn't want to start something that couldn't be undone. He said maybe in a few weeks, when he was feeling stronger. He never felt stronger. Gerald died on the morning of February 13th, 2023, a Monday, at 7:14 a.m. I was holding his hand. The magnolia in the front yard had just begun to bud. I did not call Harold that week. I did not call anyone about documents or accounts or deeds. I made funeral arrangements. I called Diane. I sat in a house that felt 3 times its actual size, and I tried to remember how to breathe. And while I was doing that, Daniel was moving. On Tuesday, the day after Gerald died, Daniel called to tell me he was handling everything. The death certificates, the notifications to financial institutions, the insurance claims. He said I shouldn't worry about any of it. He said I should rest. On Wednesday, he came to the house with more papers. He said they were related to estate administration, that they needed to be filed quickly to avoid delays. I signed where he pointed. I did not read. On Thursday, he called to say the investment account had been transferred into the trust for probate purposes. He said this was standard procedure. On Friday morning, I woke up and made coffee and stood at my kitchen window, looking at the magnolia tree my husband had planted, and I thought, this house doesn't feel like mine anymore. I thought it was grief. It was not grief. The call that changed everything came on a Saturday, 6 days after Gerald died. It was Harold Simmons. He had seen the obituary in the paper and was calling to offer his condolences. We spoke for a few minutes about Gerald. And then Harold said something that stopped me cold. He said, "Margaret, I want you to know that if you need any help sorting through the estate, I'm available. I do want to mention, and I hope this doesn't alarm you, I received a letter about 3 weeks ago from a firm I didn't recognize, notifying me that my services would no longer be needed regarding the Caldwell family estate. Signed with what appeared to be Gerald's signature. I thought it was strange, and I've been meaning to call." The room tilted. I sat down on the kitchen chair. I said, Harold. What letter? We never sent you a letter. Silence on the line. Then he said, Margaret. I think you need to come to my office on Monday. And I think you should not sign anything else until you do. I went to Harold's office that Monday. I brought every document I could find, every folder Daniel had given me over the past 2 years, every paper I had signed without reading. Harold spread them across his conference table and read them in silence for 40 minutes while I sat across from him and watched his face. When he looked up, his expression told me everything before he said a single word. The power of attorney, signed by me in August of 2021, buried in the second page of what Daniel had described as an insurance update, gave Daniel full authority over all financial decisions on behalf of both me and Gerald, effective immediately and without limitation. The deed signed by me in March of 2022, the same week I had called the bank about the account change and then done nothing, had transferred ownership of our home out of our names and into the Caldwell Family Trust. The trust documents, signed by Gerald and me on separate occasions, always presented as something routine, something already reviewed, named Daniel as sole trustee with complete discretionary authority over all assets. There was no co-trustee. There was no oversight mechanism. There was no requirement that he account to either of us for any decision he made. The investment account, $278,000, the savings of our entire working lives, had been transferred into the trust in January 2023, 1 month before Gerald died, under the authority of the power of attorney. Harold put down the last page and folded his hands. He said, The house is in the trust. The investment account is in the trust. Daniel controls the trust. As of this moment, Margaret, you have no legal ownership of your home and no access to the savings account. I heard the words. My brain processed them the way you process information during a car accident, slowly, in fragments, with an odd sense of distance. I said, Can he sell the house? Harold said, As trustee, yes. He can sell it, he can transfer it, he can mortgage it. There is nothing in the trust document preventing him from doing any of those things. I said, When did Gerald sign these? Did he understand what he was signing? Harold said, Based on the dates, the trust was established in October of 2021. Gerald's signature appears on the original trust document. Whether he understood the full implications, given his health, given the way it appears to have been presented to him, that is a question that a court would have to examine. A court. I sat in that office on the worst day of the worst week of my life, and I understood, for the first time, with complete and terrible clarity, what my son had done. He had waited. He had been patient. He had watched his father get sick, and he had seen an opportunity, and he had spent 2 years building a legal structure that would transfer everything, our home, our savings, our entire life's accumulation, into his own hands. And he had used me to do it. He had used my trust, my exhaustion, my grief, and my own professional habits turned against me. The woman who spent 30 years protecting other people's legal interests had failed to protect her own. I called Daniel from Harold's parking lot. My hands were entirely steady. I have thought about that since, how calm I was. I think I had moved past the part where your hands shake and into the part where you simply know what needs to happen. He answered on the second ring. I said, Daniel. I've just left Harold Simmons' office. A pause. Then, Mom, Harold's been retired for years. I don't think he's the right person to. I said, I know about the trust. I know about the deed. I know about the power of attorney. I know about the letter you sent dismissing him. Silence. I said, I'm giving you one opportunity to come to Harold's office with the full documentation and reverse every one of these transactions voluntarily. One opportunity. If you don't take it, I'll let the courts handle it. He said, Mom, you're grieving. You're not thinking clearly. These documents protect you. I said, Daniel. One opportunity. I hung up. He did not come to Harold's office. Harold filed the petition the following Thursday. The legal argument was built on 3 pillars. First, undue influence. Gerald had been a seriously ill man whose judgment was compromised by medication and declining health when the trust was established, and evidence suggested the documents had been presented to him in a misleading context. Second, fraud. I had signed documents whose actual contents were materially different from what Daniel had represented them to be. Third, breach of fiduciary duty. By moving to effectively disinherit his own mother while acting as trustee of a trust that included her home and her assets, Daniel had violated every principle of the role he had assumed. Harold also contacted the Georgia Secretary of State's office regarding the notary who had witnessed and certified the power of attorney document. Within 2 weeks, that individual, a man named Preston, whom I had never met, had surrendered his notary commission in lieu of a formal investigation. Daniel hired an attorney. A good one, from a firm downtown, the kind of attorney that costs significant money and signals that the person hiring them intends to fight. For 2 months, they fought. Daniel's attorney argued that all the documents had been signed voluntarily and that I was suffering from post-bereavement confusion. He argued that Gerald had been mentally competent when he signed the trust. He argued that the trust arrangement was actually protective of my interests and that Daniel had set it up with the best of intentions. Harold brought in a forensic document specialist who examined the sequence of signatures and the timing of notarizations. She found irregularities in 3 documents, date stamps that didn't align with supporting records, a signature on one form that showed inconsistencies with other samples of Gerald's handwriting from the same period. Harold also subpoenaed Daniel's emails. In those emails, sent over a period of 18 months beginning shortly after Gerald's diagnosis, Daniel had documented his plan in remarkable detail. There were messages to his own attorney outlining the trust structure and its purpose. There were messages to Preston the notary coordinating the certification of documents. There was a message sent 3 days after Gerald's diagnosis in which Daniel wrote, "Dad is not going to last more than a couple of years. We need to get the structure in place before his condition deteriorates further or before Mom figures out what we're doing. Before Mom figures out what we're doing." I have read that sentence many times since Harold showed it to me. I have read it until it stopped making me feel anything, which took longer than I expected. The case did not go to trial. In April of 2023, 2 months after Gerald died and 6 weeks after Harold filed the petition, Daniel's attorney requested a settlement conference. In June of 2023, Daniel agreed to the following: full rescission of the family trust, with all assets returned to my sole ownership, full rescission of the deed, restoring the house to my name, return of the investment account, which had not been touched and remained at $278,000, repayment of $14,200 in legal and administrative fees I had incurred, and a formal written acknowledgement that the power of attorney had been obtained by misrepresentation. He also agreed, as a condition of settlement and at Harold's insistence, to a permanent guardianship restriction, meaning that for the rest of my life, Daniel cannot serve as any legal representative of my affairs without independent legal review and court approval. In exchange, I agreed not to pursue criminal charges. Harold advised me I could have pushed further. The email evidence was strong. A criminal fraud case was possible, though not certain. I thought about it for a long time. In the end, I decided that I had already given enough years of my life to managing Daniel's consequences. A criminal trial would take 2 to 3 more years. It would be public. It would involve Diane, our grandchildren, everyone who had known Gerald. It would require me to spend what should be the final chapter of my life sitting in courtrooms instead of living. I chose my life. I want to be clear about what that decision was and was not. It was not forgiveness. I have not forgiven Daniel, and I do not expect to. Forgiveness is a process I may undertake someday for my own sake, not for his. What I chose was freedom, the freedom to stop letting what he did define how I spend my time. Daniel and I have not spoken since the settlement. I do not know where he is. I do not ask. Diane came to Atlanta the week after the settlement was finalized. She spent 10 days with me. We ate on the back porch in the evenings, the way Gerald and I used to, and we talked about her children and about her memories of her father and about what it means to rebuild something after it has been taken from you. On her last morning, she stood in the front yard and put her hand on the magnolia tree her father planted. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The house is mine. The savings are mine. The life Gerald and I built together is still here, intact, recorded in the wood and the brick and the tree out front. My son tried to take it. He did not succeed. I am telling this story because I spent 30 years helping other people protect their legal interests, and I still walked into this. If it could happen to me, it can happen to anyone. There are a few things I want you to take from what I've shared. First, read everything before you sign it. Every single page. It doesn't matter who hands it to you, how much you trust them, or how tired you are. 30 years of professional knowledge didn't protect me when I let exhaustion and trust override the habit of reading. Nothing will protect you if you don't read what's in front of you. Second, have your own attorney. Not a family member's attorney, not a firm that someone else recommended, not a notary you've never met. Your own attorney, who knows you, who represents only you, and who you can call when something doesn't feel right. Third, if something doesn't feel right, call. I had 4 moments when something felt wrong. I explained all 4 of them away. Gerald had one clear moment of doubt, and he chose not to act on it because he didn't want to cause trouble. That choice cost us 2 years and nearly everything we had built. The call you don't make is the one you can't take back. And fourth, and this is the one I think about the most, grief is a vulnerability, and people who want to take from you know that. The weeks immediately following a death are the most dangerous time for financial predators, even when those predators are your own family. If you have recently lost someone, or if you know someone who has, please pass this story along. Do not sign anything in the first month after a loss. Do not make financial decisions. Let the paperwork wait. Whatever they tell you about urgency, it can wait. I am still in my house on Briarcliff Road. The magnolia is blooming this spring. I have coffee on the back porch most evenings, and sometimes I talk to Gerald the way you talk to people who aren't there anymore, and I tell him that the house is fine and the savings are fine and Diane's children are growing up beautifully. I think he would have been proud of how this ended. There are things that can be taken from you, and there are things that cannot. Where are you watching from today? Leave a comment and tell me, and if this story reached someone who needed to hear it, please share it. You might not know whose life you're protecting when you do. I'll be here. Thank you for listening.